The engines rumbled like thunder as a long line of motorcycles rolled out of the small town. The morning sun was bright, the air was crisp, and the sound of leather jackets brushing against metal filled the street. The bikers weren't out for fun that day. They had gathered for something bigger. It was a charity ride, meant to raise money for children who were fighting for their lives in hospitals. For many of them, it wasn't just about riding. It was about giving back, about proving that their tough looks didn't define who they really were inside. Families stood by the sidewalks, clapping and waving as the bikes roared past. Children held little flags and cheered, their eyes wide with excitement. Some even ran up close to the edge of the road, eager to see the shiny chrome and hear the powerful growl of the machines. The bikers raised their hands in return, some even honking their horns to make the kids laugh. It was a picture of unity, of people coming together for a good cause. And for a while it felt like nothing could go wrong. But not everyone saw it that way. In the crowd, a few faces stayed cold. There were people who had always looked at bikers with suspicion. To them, leather jackets meant danger, and tattoos meant trouble. They didn't see the good cause behind the ride. They only saw noise, disruption, and a group they didn't trust. Still, the bikers kept riding, knowing that the louder they roared, the more awareness they brought to their mission. At the heart of the group rode a man who had been part of charity rides for years. His beard was gray from age, his hands strong from years of working hard, and his eyes focused on the road ahead. He knew the importance of this ride. He had seen how donations could make the difference between a family giving up and a family holding on to hope. The other bikers respected him, often looking to him for quiet guidance. To them, he was proof that being part of the road wasn't just about toughness. It was about loyalty, brotherhood, and compassion. The ride moved smoothly for miles. The line of motorcycles stretched long and steady, a moving wall of determination. People came out of shops and houses to wave them on. Some even dropped coins and bills into the collection boxes attached to a few of the bikes. It was a reminder that kindness could be contagious. One person's decision to ride for a cause had inspired many others to help in their own way. Still, under the surface, there was an uneasy feeling. Some of the bikers noticed people glaring from windows, muttering to each other on corners. They knew how quickly misunderstandings could start. A look, a word, even the sound of an engine revving too loud could set someone off. But they didn't want trouble. They weren't there to fight. They were there to give, to ride, and to finish what they had started. As the road curved, the scenery shifted. The bustling cheers of the town faded into quieter streets. The sound of children laughing was replaced by the hum of engines echoing against old brick walls. The bikers kept steady, riding 2 by 2, their jackets marked with symbols of loyalty and unity. They believed in showing strength, but they also believed in using that strength for good. One rider at the back glanced at the sky, noticing how the sunlight was fading behind clouds. He had been on enough rides to know that weather could change moods, just like it could change the road. But what weighed heavier on his mind wasn't the weather. It was the feeling that eyes were still watching, waiting, maybe even hoping for them to slip up. And yet, for every frown they passed, there was a smile waiting just ahead. An elderly woman stood on her porch, waving a little scarf in the air. A group of teenagers clapped as the bikes roared past, some even pulling out their phones to record the moment. It was a reminder that no matter what some people thought, there were many others who understood. They saw the heart behind the leather. They saw the mission, not the stereotype. The road stretched on, carrying them further from the comfort of cheering crowds and deeper into the unknown parts of town. The bikers stayed close, trusting each other, moving like one body with many wheels. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. The sound of the engines was their language, and the bond they shared was stronger than words. Every mile was a mile closer to helping children who needed them, and that thought kept them going. What no one knew was that just up ahead, things were about to change. The smooth ride was about to take a turn that none of them expected. The cheering crowds would be left behind, and the goodwill of the day would soon be tested in ways they could not imagine. The road wasn't just about charity anymore, it was about to become a road of challenge. And what happened next would decide whether the ride ended in hope or in heartbreak. The bikers rode on, their engines humming like a steady drumbeat against the quiet streets. The farther they went from the center of town, the fewer cheering faces they saw. Instead of waving hands and bright smiles, they now passed closed shops, empty sidewalks, and windows where curtains twitched as if someone was watching from behind. The sense of celebration slowly began to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence that settled over the group. One of the riders glanced at the man beside him and gave a small nod, as if to say, "Stay sharp." The others noticed it too. Something about the air felt different here. It wasn't just the lack of support from the locals. It was the way the streets seemed heavier, the way the atmosphere carried a tension that wasn't there before. The bikers weren't strangers to suspicion. They knew how they looked to outsiders, tough, intimidating, even threatening. But they weren't here to fight. They were here to finish their ride, to bring hope to children who needed it most. Then it happened. At the next corner, a group of men stood in the middle of the road. They weren't smiling or waving like the families had been earlier. Their arms were crossed, their faces hard, and they made no move to step aside. The bikers slowed, their tires crunching on the pavement, the roar of engines softening as they pulled to a stop. The air grew colder in that moment, as if the sun had suddenly hidden behind the clouds. The lead rider, the older man who had guided countless rides before, lifted his hand for the group to stay calm. He eased his bike forward just a little, careful not to provoke. The men on the road shouted something, accusing the bikers of disturbing the peace, of scaring people with their noise. The words stung because they weren't true. But the bikers knew this wasn't about truth. It was about fear, about judgment, and maybe even about anger that had been waiting for an excuse to spill out. One of the younger bikers clenched, his fists on the handlebars, his jaw tight. He wanted to speak up, to defend their cause, to shout back that this was for sick children and struggling families. But he remembered the leader's calm signal and held back. The riders weren't there to argue. They weren't there to turn a charity ride into a confrontation. Still, the tension grew. The crowd on the sidewalks grew too, drawn by the standoff. Some whispered among themselves. Others pulled out their phones, recording every moment as if waiting for something explosive to happen. The bikers tried to explain. One of them raised his voice, saying they were riding to raise money for children in hospitals, that every mile they rode was another chance for someone to donate. But the men blocking the road didn't care. They shouted louder, accusing the group of being nothing more than troublemakers hiding behind charity. The words were sharp, cutting through the calm the riders were trying to keep. The situation teetered on the edge. The longer it dragged on, the more restless the crowd became. The bikers could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered word, every assumption being made about them. It was unfair, but it wasn't new. They had lived with these looks for years. The difference now was that their mission, something good and pure, was at risk of being lost in the anger of strangers who refused to see beyond leather and engines. Then, in the middle of the shouting, someone from the crowd threw a glass bottle. It hit the pavement near the riders, shattering with a loud crack that echoed down the street. The shards scattered under the wheels of the bikes, and a sharp silence followed. The bikers froze, their hearts pounding. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. This was no longer just about words. It could easily become something worse. The younger riders tensed, ready to defend themselves if they had to. But the leader's voice, calm yet firm, cut through the rising heat. "Hold steady," he said, his tone carrying the weight of experience. They trusted him, so they stayed still, even as the men blocking the road stepped closer, their voices louder, their gestures sharper. The line between a charity ride and a street brawl had become frighteningly thin. The townspeople, who had gathered now, looked torn. Some shook their heads, muttering that this was exactly why bikers weren't to be trusted. Others looked worried, their eyes darting between the group on the road and the bikers who had come with a message of hope. No one knew how it would end. And then, just as the shouting grew too loud to control, a small figure began to move through the crowd. An elderly man, thin but upright, stepped forward. His steps were slow but steady, his presence quiet yet impossible to ignore. He didn't shout, didn't wave his arms, didn't try to match the chaos with more chaos. He simply walked closer, his eyes focused not on anger but on something deeper. The bikers turned their heads slightly, noticing him. The men blocking the road paused for a moment, confused by his boldness. The crowd hushed, curious. No one expected an elderly man to step into the middle of a conflict that could easily spiral out of control. Yet here he was, moving forward with nothing but courage in his heart. What he was about to say would change everything. The street was still, every sound swallowed by the weight of tension. The bikers sat on their motorcycles, gripping their handlebars, eyes fixed on the men blocking the road. The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between curiosity and fear. Then, all eyes turned toward the elderly man who had stepped forward. His back was slightly bent from age, but his steps carried a quiet strength. He wasn't fast, but with every step closer, it felt as though the noise in the street dimmed. The men in front frowned, their angry words faltering as they watched him approach. He didn't look like someone who could stop a confrontation. He wasn't tall, wasn't strong, wasn't loud. Yet something about his presence slowed everything down, as if the street itself respected him. The bikers noticed it too. They had seen plenty of fights, seen men twice his size back down, but never had they seen silence commanded in this way. The elderly man finally stopped between the bikers and the group blocking the road. His hands hung calmly at his sides, and his gaze swept over both sides. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, not loud, but strong enough for everyone to hear. "You think they are here to cause trouble?" he asked, his words directed at the men in the road. "Look at them. Look at their eyes. Do you see anger, or do you see purpose?" The crowd shifted again, murmurs passing through as people leaned in. The bikers remained silent, engines off now, waiting. The men blocking the road hesitated, their bravado dimming just slightly. The old man's question lingered in the air. He went on. "I know what these rides are for. I lost my grandson years ago. He was only 6 years old when illness took him. Do you know what gave us hope in those hard days?" His voice cracked for just a second, enough to make people listen closer. It was efforts like this. Riders coming together, strangers donating what they could, people fighting for children who had no fight left in them. "Do you still think these men are your enemies?" The effect was instant. The bikers sat taller, their hearts stirred by the man's words. The crowd softened, some lowering their phones, realizing this wasn't a show to record, but a moment to respect. Even a few of the men who had been shouting now looked uneasy, shifting their feet as if the ground beneath them no longer felt as solid. One of them muttered something about noise, about disruption, but the old man shook his head gently. "Noise? That noise is the sound of hope. Every roar of their engines carries the message that no child is forgotten, that no family has to suffer alone. Do you really want to silence that?" The biker's leader, still sitting calmly on his bike, felt something shift inside him. For years he had carried the burden of being judged by appearances. He had led ride after ride, always fighting against stereotypes, always trying to prove their cause was real. And here, in just a few sentences, this elderly man had done more to explain their purpose than he ever could. The crowd grew quiet again, listening, waiting for what would happen next. The old man turned fully toward the riders now, his eyes kind but firm. "And you," he said softly, "hold steady. Do not let anger take away the goodness you bring. You ride not for yourselves, but for those who need you. Remember that." The bikers nodded slightly, understanding the weight of his words. None of them spoke, but the message was clear. They would not let this turn violent, no matter what. For a long moment, no one moved. The standoff hung in the air, ready to tip one way or the other. Then, almost reluctantly, one of the men blocking the road stepped back. His shoulders slumped as though the fight had drained out of him. Another followed, and soon the rest shifted aside, leaving the path clear. The elderly man hadn't raised a hand, hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened. All he had offered were his words, his memory, and his courage. Yet it was enough to break through walls that anger and suspicion had built. The bikers exhaled in relief, though they stayed calm, their engines still quiet. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to clap softly. It wasn't the loud cheering from earlier in the ride, but it was something deeper. It was respect. Respect for the bikers who had shown restraint, and respect for the elderly man who had stepped in where no one else dared. One little boy on the sidewalk tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "is he a hero?" His mother, eyes glistening, nodded slowly. "Yes, son. He is." The old man gave a small nod to the riders, then slowly stepped back toward the sidewalk. His part was done. The choice was now theirs, whether to ride on with bitterness or with renewed purpose. The leader looked at his fellow bikers, then started his engine again, the roar echoing not as a threat, but as a promise. The ride was not over. But from this moment on, it would carry more than just the sound of engines. It would carry the memory of an elderly man who had turned a dark moment into a lesson of compassion, unity, and quiet strength. And though none of them would forget the trouble they had faced, they knew this: sometimes the smallest voice can be the one that saves the day. Asterisk. The street felt lighter after the men stepped aside, but the silence still hung like a shadow. The bikers sat on their motorcycles, hearts pounding, trying to process what had just happened. The elderly man had returned to the edge of the crowd, his hands folded calmly in front of him, but his presence lingered in the air like a steady flame. For a few moments, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the leader of the bikers revved his engine, not in anger, but in respect. The sound carried down the street, and the other riders followed one by one, their machines growling like a choir with a purpose. The crowd, still shaken, began to clap again. It wasn't the playful cheering from the start of the ride. This time it was heavier, more meaningful, like applause for a lesson learned. People realized what had almost happened, and how close they had been to misunderstanding something good. The old man had not only stopped the clash, he had reminded them all of what the ride was truly about. As the bikers started to move forward again, the elderly man raised his hand gently. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the engines. They paused, curious. He stepped forward again, slower this time, as if the weight of years had suddenly caught up with him. His face was calm, but his eyes held memories that words alone could not describe. He turned to the crowd first. "Do you know why I stood in front of those men just now?" he asked softly. The people shifted, waiting. "Because I remember what it feels like to be judged. I remember what it feels like to carry pain, and I know how easy it is to see only the surface. These riders, you think they are here for noise? For show? No. They are here because they care. They ride for the children who cannot ride, for the families who sit in hospital rooms praying for a miracle." The murmurs faded. People leaned closer, listening with full attention. Even the men who had caused the trouble now looked down at the ground, their anger replaced by something else, maybe guilt, maybe reflection. The old man's voice trembled slightly, but it never lost its strength. "Years ago, I lost my grandson. He was only 6. I sat in hospital rooms, helpless, praying for help that never came. But in those days, when I felt like the world had turned its back on me, I saw strangers fight for children like him. They raised money. They gave time. They rode through towns just like this one. And for a moment, it felt like we weren't alone. That hope, it mattered. It still matters. The bikers bowed their heads respectfully, the weight of his words touching even their hardened hearts. They understood loss. They understood pain. But hearing it spoken in such a raw and human way reminded them why they were there. This wasn't just a ride. It was a promise, a chain of hope passed down from one person to another. The elderly man then turned to the riders. You carry more than engines and leather. You carry hope. Do not let anger steal that from you. Do not let judgment silence you. Keep riding, for every child, for every family, for every person who needs to know they are not forgotten. The leader of the bikers, his eyes shining beneath his sunglasses, placed his hand on his chest as a sign of respect. The other riders did the same. They didn't need to say a word. Their silence spoke louder than any promise. A woman in the crowd wiped a tear from her cheek. A young man who had doubted the bikers earlier now stepped forward, pulling a few bills from his pocket and dropping them into one of the collection boxes attached to a motorcycle. One act sparked another. Soon, more people came forward, offering coins, bills, and even small notes of encouragement. What had started as a confrontation was now turning into something else, a wave of support that even the bikers hadn't expected. The elderly man stepped back at last, his part complete. He didn't need applause. He didn't need thanks. He only needed to see that the message was clear. Kindness can't be measured by appearances, and sometimes the most fragile-looking person carries the strongest voice. The riders started their engines again, this time with the crowd cheering, not out of excitement, but out of respect. It was no longer just a charity ride. It was a ride blessed by wisdom, softened by compassion, and strengthened by the courage of a single man who chose to step forward when no one else did. As they rolled forward, the leader looked over his shoulder one last time. The elderly man stood still, a small smile on his face, watching them disappear down the road. It was a moment none of them would forget, a reminder that true heroes don't always wear leather or ride motorcycles. Sometimes they wear wrinkles and walk with slow, steady steps, and though the road ahead still stretched long, the riders carried something new with them now, an unspoken promise that they would finish the journey not only for the children they rode for, but also for the man who had reminded them and everyone else what the ride was truly about. The engines roared back to life, but this time their sound carried a different weight. It wasn't the sharp thunder that made people frown or cover their ears. It was steady, proud, and full of meaning. The bikers moved forward again, the line of motorcycles stretching long and strong, a wave of chrome and leather flowing down the road. Behind them, the crowd cheered, and some even waved once more, their faces softened by what they had witnessed. The ride that had nearly fallen apart was alive again, stitched back together by the courage of one elderly man. As the riders pushed onward, their hearts felt lighter. The tension from the confrontation still lingered in their minds, but the memory of the man's words burned brighter. They replayed his story silently, each rider reminding himself why he was there, why every mile mattered. They weren't riding for themselves, and they weren't riding to prove toughness. They were riding for children who lay in hospital beds, for families who held hope like a fragile thread, and for communities that needed to see unity instead of division. The leader of the bikers rode at the front, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and humility. He had seen many rides in his time, faced many challenges on the road, but this one felt different. This ride had tested them not with rain, broken engines, or long miles, but with misunderstanding and anger. And yet, they had come through not because of strength or numbers, but because of the wisdom of someone who had no bike, no leather jacket, no roaring engine. Just a voice that refused to be ignored. As they neared the next town, people were already waiting. Word of what had happened seemed to have traveled faster than the riders themselves. Families stood with signs of encouragement, children waved with bright smiles, and donation buckets filled quicker than anyone expected. Strangers who had once judged now opened their arms, eager to show support. The bikers were stunned, realizing that sometimes the darkest moments create the brightest light. Along the route, one rider carried a small notebook where he often wrote down stories from the road. That day, he scribbled a few words. The day an old man saved a ride. It wasn't just for them. It was a memory they would carry and share, proof that heroes can appear in the most unexpected forms. The charity run ended hours later, at a large open park where families gathered to welcome them. The bikes parked side by side, forming a line of steel and strength, but the real power that day wasn't in the engines. It was in the unity that had carried them through. The riders removed their helmets, sweat on their brows, but pride in their eyes. Children ran up to hug them, parents thanked them, and volunteers quickly began counting the donations. The amount raised was more than they had hoped for, enough to help several families through their hardest battles. The bikers smiled, their hearts full, knowing that the mission had been worth every mile, every challenge, every moment of doubt. Yet in the middle of all the celebration, their thoughts returned to the old man. The riders knew they would never forget him. They hadn't even asked his name, but perhaps that made it more powerful. He wasn't seeking recognition, applause, or fame. He had simply stepped in when he was needed most and left behind a story that would live far longer than any roar of an engine. As the sun began to set, the leader of the bikers looked at the horizon. He thought of the elderly man's grandson, the boy whose life had been lost too soon. He thought of the children they were helping now, children who still had a chance because of kindness, because of hope, because of strangers who cared enough to ride. And he thought of how a man who had known great loss had turned that pain into wisdom that saved them all. Before leaving the park, the bikers made a silent pact. From that day forward, every ride would carry more than just their cause. It would carry the story of the man who had reminded them of their purpose. Wherever they went, whenever people questioned their intentions, they would share what happened that day. They would tell how a ride almost fell apart, and how a single voice brought it back together. Night fell, and the riders prepared to head home. Their engines growled once more, but instead of sounding harsh, it sounded like a promise. They rode away not as misunderstood men on motorcycles, but as symbols of unity and resilience. And somewhere, back in that small town, an old man sat quietly in his chair, perhaps unaware of the impact he had made. Yet the world would remember, because those bikers would never let his story fade. The ride had taken a dark turn, but in the end, it became brighter than anyone expected. It became more than just a charity run. It became a lesson that sometimes, when anger clouds the road and judgment builds walls, all it takes is one quiet hero to remind everyone what truly matters: compassion, courage, and the belief that even the smallest act can change everything.